The Ethiopian Prime Minister, already under intense pressure, faces yet another challenge. Rebels fighting his troops in Tigray are joining forces with armed fighters from his own ethnic group. How much of a threat does this pose to Abiy Ahmed and to Ethiopia? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vanel. Months of violence in Ethiopia's Tigray region have highlighted the growing ethnic divide, awakened old rivalries and produced odd alliances. A Nobel Peace Prize winning Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, might be complicating things even further. Earlier this week, he called on, in his words, all capable Ethiopians to join the army and stop the region's rebels once and for all. But in a twist of events, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, responded by joining forces with another rebel group, the Oromo Liberation Army, to fight the government. It means the conflict is no longer contained in one region, and there are growing fears it could lead to an all-out civil war. The Ethiopian government condemns this latest escalation.
No group can claim to be for the people of Oromia while it is using or it is killing the people of the region for its individual political gains. And no entity can also claim to be for the people of Tigray where it's also killing its own people and holding them hostage for its own political gains. Let's not also forget that TPLF tortured, killed, displaced, and disappeared many Oromo youth, brandishing them as part of the Shene organization. So I don't believe that the youth of Oromia region are in alignment with this as well, because this is an alignment of two terrorist organizations.
Now, the Oromo Liberation Army is the military wing of the Oromo Liberation Front political party. Ethiopia's largest ethnic group says it suffered a long history of oppression dating back a century. In 2015, plans to expand the capital, Addis Ababa, further into Oromo farmlands triggered 3 years of protests and of violent repression. This eventually forced the resignation of the Prime Minister and paved the way for Abiy Ahmed and Oromo himself. But some now accuse him of neglecting the community, just like the leaders of the past. The Tigray People's Liberation Front is the product of the marginalization of the Tigray ethnic minority more than a century ago. But the group dominated national Ethiopian politics for 30 years, until Abiy Ahmed became Prime Minister in 2018. The current violence is partly a result of a power struggle. At the end of November, the government announced its forces had taken control of Tigray's regional capital, Mekelle. But the conflict took a stunning turn in June when Tigrayan forces took back Mekelle and government soldiers withdrew. Since then, the rebels have pressed into the regions of Afar in the east and Amhara in the south. All right, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Cambridge, we have William Davison, Ethiopia Senior Analyst at International Crisis Group. From Addis Ababa, Samuel Gerechu, who is a journalist from Ethiopia. And from London, Awal Allo, Senior Lecturer in Law at Keele University. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us here on Al Jazeera's Inside Story. I'd like to begin with you, William Davison. Just give our viewers an understanding of how powerful the Oromo Liberation Army actually is and how significant is this development?
I think it's a significant development because it's the first time a major Ethiopian opposition force has shown its support, its willingness to ally with the Tigrayan forces, which are showing their capabilities and increasingly on the offensive outside of Tigray as they try and pressure the federal government to come to the negotiating table on their terms and ultimately push for a transitional government. The Oromo Liberation Army is an increasingly important Oromo opposition actor. Its apparent increase in popularity and capability comes as and after the major Oromo opposition parties, the Oromo Federalist Congress, the Oromo Liberation Front. They did not participate in the recent election alleging government repression. And that seems to have led to an increasing focus on the Oromo Liberation Army. And indeed, they have shown signs of increasing capability.
Okay.
So it's a very significant political alliance. What we haven't seen yet is whether the OLA really has the same sort of military capability as the Tigrayan forces have demonstrated.
And that will be crucial, of course. Samuel Getachew, I'd like to bring you in. What's your take on how this alliance might potentially deepen this conflict?
As William said, it's a huge coalition. It's a milestone in this conflict. But you also have to understand the partnership is only based on strategic advice. It's not a partnership per se to get into this conflict. The difference between the TPLF and OLA is day and night. For the last 27 years before the Prime Minister came to power, they were fighting against the TPLF government, the TPLF-led coalition government in Addis Ababa. So while it's an achievement, I have to say, I don't think it's as grand or as huge as it's being made out to be, because the partnership is just at the beginning stage, and it might not go forward. We just have to wait and see. But the Ethiopian side is insisting that they have a more grand or a bigger coalition to fight on. They're hopeful that they will defeat the TPLF and the OLA, and that's where we are at the moment. But this conflict moves on, and more people are certain to be affected by this coalition or the conflict moving forward.
Awal Allo, what's your take? What's your assessment of this alliance? Do you foresee both sides expanding their fights to other areas in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I think this is an enormously significant development for two reasons. One, these are two forces that have a very common strategic goal in terms of the future direction of the country. Both the Oromo Liberation Army, that is widely supported now by the Oromo population, which is the largest ethnic constituency in Ethiopia, and the Tigray Defense Forces agree on a federated future for the Ethiopian state. So the fact that you have that strategic political alliance is significant. And on the back of that strategic political alliance, we now have a military alliance between the two forces to take on the Ethiopian government. So, and also it's important from kind of a geographical point of view, because the Tigray Defense Forces from the northern part have already shown their strength. They have already forced the Ethiopian military and the Eritrean Eritrean troops from their territory. So they have proven themselves to be a force to reckon with. Now they are entering into a partnership with the Oromo Liberation Army that is operating in the western, southern, eastern part of the country. I think from a kind of a geographic point of view also gives the two forces strategic advantage. And I think, when you look at the political landscape and also these military coalitions, what we are looking at is probably, in my view, the beginning of the end of the Abiy Ahmed era.
William, I'd like to come back to you. How do you think that the government will be viewing these developments?
Well, I think that's very, very clear, partly because both these organizations, as in the TPLF, Tigray's ruling party, and the Oromo Liberation Army, the government calls it Shane, both of these organizations have been classified as terrorist organizations. So I think, that designation signifies just how badly this transition has gone. The idea of this transition was to create a more inclusive political space in Ethiopia, and then come to some form of arrangement about the country's future. Instead, these actors who have an understanding of Ethiopia that it should be organized as a multinational federation, they have been increasingly excluded, and indeed the TPLF and the Tigrayan forces now find themselves in a civil war with the federal government. As a result of that fallout, we've had these terrorist designations. Now that the Tigrayan forces are on the offensive to try and force a transitional government, which is something the OLA has also been trying to achieve, all we're seeing here is an intensification and an expansion of Ethiopia's civil war. It is very hard to say, I think, as Samuel correctly described, just how meaningful this alliance is going to be. And as, but as Awal says, this could be the end of Abiy Ahmed's government. But what we know for sure is that this is going to lead to that intensification of the fighting, increasing devastation, not just for the people actively involved in the combat, but also civilians. And the threat that the already severe blows to Ethiopia's stability that we've seen could get even worse as this conflict widens.
Samuel Getachew, how embattled is the Ethiopian army at this point?
I mean, it's been a challenge, I have to admit, but I would have to disagree with Aulo in terms of this MOU that's signed by TPLF and OLA being the beginning of the end of the prime minister. If that is an indication that it is the end of his era, I think that's wrong. That's a wrong assumption. But, in terms of the Ethiopian army, they did face challenges. But, the Ethiopian army is one of the strongest within the East Africa. And it will, the prime minister has called for, young people to join. It's a challenge. Tigray remains to be a very challenging aspect of the new prime minister who was just elected. We can disagree on how the process of the election and so on, but I'm just saying in terms of him being elected. But I think the Ethiopian government is, the determination is there. They have the numbers, but, they can really make a comeback. But I have to recognize in terms of TPLF getting into different regions, including the Amhara regions, the Afar regions, is an indication that the army is not really performing as planned, according to the Ethiopian government.
I want to pick up on that, Samuel, about talking about the army perhaps not performing as it should. You did refer to it as one of the strongest armies in the region. A new Amnesty report came out, I believe, just in the past few days, detailing widespread rape and sexual violence carried out by the Ethiopian Defence Force and the Eritrean Defence Force. And I quote, soldiers and militias subjected Tigrayan women and girls to rape, gang rape, sexual slavery, sexual mutilation and other forms of torture, often using ethnic slurs and death threats. I mean, that is damning. How has the government responded to those allegations?
The Ethiopian government is insisting that there is going to be an open investigation done along with the United Nations. I hope that will become a reality. I'm not sure if there's going to be resources because the allegations are vast. The accusations are not just with the Ethiopian army, it's with the Eritreans as well as the TPLF. I've read the report from Amnesty International that came out a few days ago. Amnesty International has its own shortcomings, but I respect them. I've read the report, but the fact is, the investigation has to be, between all sides. I've been to the Tigray region. I've said this before. The allegations are, not just within a certain group. It's with all sides. And I hope Amnesty International will have a bigger investigation so we know exactly what happened and we can have a roadmap where we can go as humans or as Ethiopians. Right.
Awal Alo, I'd like to bring you in. Any reaction that you have to Samuel's take on this report from Amnesty International? I'm interested. And also, where do you believe the beginning of this conflict really lay? Was it in Tigray? Was it in Oromo? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, sure. So the conflict is basically ideological in nature. It is differences of opinion on the future direction the country has to take. You have on the one hand the prime minister who wants to centralize power and wants to return what he envisions as a glorious past of the Ethiopian state, a vision of the future that most people in Oromo, in Tigray, in southern part of the country do not agree with. On the other hand, you have a vision that is upheld and endorsed by the majority of political forces in Oromo, in Tigray, and other parts of the country, which basically calls for a federated Ethiopia where regional autonomies are respected and people that are distinct would have the right to use their language, promote their culture, govern themselves at the regional level. It is this clash of visions that have led to the conflict. And this war essentially started in Oromia when the Prime Minister essentially turned to police and intelligence and court system to marginalize the opposition and go after the Oromo Liberation Army in the western part. When the Prime Minister went to war in Tigray, he has to get into a full-scale armored confrontation with the support of the Eritreans because he could not do in Tigray what he did in Oromia. Tigray was fairly independent. It was very well armed. It was in a position to defend itself. So it was this clash of visions. I think this war started in Oromia first. And Samuel made the point that the Ethiopian military was one of the strongest militaries in the Horn of Africa, and I agree with him. And it was the case that until recently, it was one of the most, I think it's a military force with significant reputation externally. And what the Prime Minister did by taking the country to this war without meaningful consideration of what the consequence of this war would be, is to undermine not only the reputation of the military, but almost all state institutions. The Ethiopian military that represents about 110 million people with the support of the Eritrean army was forced by a defense force that represents a region of 6 million people. And I think that sends a very negative signal to friends and foes of the Ethiopian state in the region. So although the military is fairly strong until recently, I think it is no longer in a position now to even defend itself from rebel forces and from organized forces within the country. In terms of the allegations of human rights and the Amnesty report, and I think the report actually only begins to scratch the surface. The abuses that we have heard about, the various witness testimonies that have been in the media, it was shocking. And while it may be true that there are various forces that are complicit, but the fact that the Ethiopian military that is responsible and the Eritrean military that were responsible have not properly wanted to account for these atrocious crimes. And I think that says quite a lot about the views of the authorities and the military itself.
William Davison, I'd like to come back to you. We're talking there about the Eritrean Defence Forces. For our international audience, we should explain Eritrean forces are fighting on the side of the Ethiopian government, despite many calls for them to withdraw. What is Eritrea's interest here?
The Eritrea military has actually significantly withdrawn from the conflict in Tigray at around the same time as Ethiopia's federal government withdrew. And that was largely due to the resurgence of the Tigrayan forces. And now Eritrea is thought to be largely protecting areas of northern Tigray, northern Ethiopia, that it claims as its own, but are disputed. I think Eritrea's motivation was similar to the federal government's in wanting to see the back of the TPLF as a political force. That's why they joined the federal intervention. But really the significant thing here is we see these terrorist designations by the government. We see the calls for every able-bodied citizen to join the fight against the TPLF and against the OLA. We see the call for militias and extra federal troops and regional. But this is in the context of this war where we have seen these many reports of human rights abuses, and essentially in Tigray, and essentially the Tigrayan people have stood by their leaders and stood by Tigray's rights to autonomy. And it's a similar situation in Oromia. The government may designate the OLA as terrorists, but what the OLA represents has considerable support from the Oromo people. So whilst the federal government presents itself as legitimate, and therefore these counterinsurgency campaigns as legitimate and just, the problem is that they are going up against huge numbers of Ethiopian people. That is why they are going to be, that is why they have been so devastating so far, both in Oromia and in Tigray. And that is why this intensification is said to be so deadly. These are not just small cliques of terrorists. These are actually relatively popular armed insurgencies.
Samuel Getachew, on that point, Oromo Liberation Army leader Kumsa Diriba says there's going to be a grand coalition against Abiy Ahmed and that other groups will join in. Do you foresee that playing out?
I don't think so. What I know for certain is this conflict is not going to end anytime soon. There might be different coalitions, again, between TPLF and OLA. It's just MOU that was signed by two different functions that are as different as day and night. And we don't think there will be any kind of coalition to defeat Ethiopia. There are certainly lots of people that see Ethiopia becoming like the former Yugoslavia, like Somalia, like the South Sudan. Some of the nations that got their independence but didn't really achieve their objectives. But I think Ethiopia will move on from this conflict because Ethiopia remains an important nation of 110 million people, as Aulo said, and we're going to begin to see hope, I hope, at the end of the tunnel. Because again, this conflict, this endless conflicts within Ethiopia, within the continent, is not in the interest of our continent. There are many, many people that are suffering. I've been to some of the towns that Aulo mentioned, William might have mentioned, including within the Oromia nation, the Oromia states, and they are just really, really sad. I was in Nakamt a year ago, trying to understand the misgiving they have with the government, and it was a real shock. And I hope Ethiopia will move forward from this conflict. I have hope.
Okay, Awal Alo, if we look regionally, what role is or should the African Union be playing to try and find a way out of this conflict?
Before I comment on that point, I just want to say, you want to make one point on what Samuel said. Samuel kind of framed the conflict in Ethiopia as one between Ethiopia and some forces. I think it's a very problematic characterization. This is a view that is kind of promoted by the Prime Minister, who doesn't even have, a popular mandate. He was elected. It was a sham election where the Prime Minister essentially ran alone. But it's not a conflict between Ethiopia and some forces. It's a conflict between two forces in Ethiopia that are in disagreement on the future direction of the country. I think that is very important. But in terms of the role the African Union could play and the regional consequences of the conflict, Ethiopia, as the largest country in the region, as a country that is responsible for regional peace and stability, who has been playing very significant roles in stabilizing some of these countries, I think the consequences of further confrontation, further antagonism, further violence in Ethiopia would be significant for countries in the region. We already have border conflicts between Sudan and Ethiopia. There are some issues between Ethiopia and South Sudan. We don't know to what extent relations between the Ethiopian state and the Eritrean state would continue as they are currently, especially given the fact that the Tigrayans now control the Tigray region to the north. So the consequences for the region is significant. In terms of the role of the African Union, I think the African Union has proven itself ineffective in terms of dealing with conflicts within member states. The Constitutive Act of the African Union declares that whenever there are, for example, allegations of war crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing, the Union is mandated to intervene and to protect the civilian population. In the Ethiopian conflict, what the African Union did essentially is side with the government and try to play down the atrocities that has been committed. So it's not clear to what extent the European Union can be a reliable partner for peace. And I think the international community needs to take a more active role.
Thank you very much for that. We will have to leave it there for time. Big thank you to all of our guests, William Davison, Samuel Gerechu and Awal Alo. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Kim Vanel, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye-bye for now.